Go ahead, Susan.
Good morning. My name is Susan Heegard. I'm the president of the Midwestern Higher Education Compact, or MEC, which is our acronym. And we're really excited about the great work you're about to learn about and looking forward to hearing from our panel of experts. We are an interstate compact composed of the 12 Midwestern census region states. And we focus on higher education. We're located in Minneapolis, right on the beautiful Mississippi River. One of our key responsibilities is to share best practices, which is why we're gathered here today. And we share those best practices across our region. And today, we're actually going to share them nationally. Just a few housekeeping matters before we begin. We are recording. Our resources will be posted to the MEC website, mec.org, under past convenings. Please use the Q&A function. We're monitoring your questions. And we'd love it if you'd complete our survey at the end so we can improve our future convening opportunities and how well we can serve you. So I'd like to introduce our panelists and get me out of the way so you can hear from them. Our focus today is on the stronger state community college finance as a lever for student success, and that work occurred in 3 states: Ohio, California, and Texas. And our panelists are Martha Snyder, who's the managing director for HCM Strategists; Stephanie Murphy, who's a director with HCM Strategists; Carmen Nguyen, a senior research assistant with CCRC, or the Community College Research Center; Ariel Deutsch, project assistant with CCRC; and Jack Hershey. Jack is one of our MEC commissioners, one of 5 in Ohio, and he's the president and CEO of the Ohio Association of Community Colleges. We're going to have a little bit of time at the end for questions, so please use that Q&A function. Let's go. We're ready to hear from you.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Good morning, everyone. We will move into the content as Susan noted. We are here to talk about financing in community colleges and really how policymakers, as well as institutional and system leaders, can leverage finance better and the broader lens of community college finance to really inform student success. Next slide, please. So Susan, this is just a overview of the panelists that Susan had already introduced. And I will go into the next slide and just kind of give a little bit of an overview of the project before I turn it over to my colleague, Stephanie Murphy. So the project is a partnership between the Community College Research Center and HCM Strategists. There are kind of 2 aspects to the project that you will hear from our other panelists today. One focused on kind of the state policy context, or a broader lens of community college financing and how state funding fits into that broader lens. And then we're looking a little bit deeper at institutional pathways and understanding institutional decisions that affect student success. The project is funded and supported by 3 primary funders: Lumina Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Ascendium. Next slide. So the project goals are, as I noted, kind of twofold. One is really to understand from a state policy lens how state post-secondary finance can better fit into and be better leveraged to deliver adequate and equitable funding models for community colleges. The institutional analysis is looking at documenting student success priorities and initiatives, and understanding the impact of those on different outcomes for students from different backgrounds, particularly from different racial and economic backgrounds, as well as understanding the funding and choice about different resource allocations to really understand how institutions can understand the impact of different institutional best practices, the costs associated with that, and ultimately to both advocate for more nuanced state policy investments, but also understand the influence of state policy and other resources that institutions are operating under to be able to make those student-centered decisions. Next slide. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie Murphy to walk through the particular details of the analysis we did in California, Ohio, and Texas.
Great. Thanks, Martha. So I'll just dive right on into the state analysis for the sake of time. But I do want to take some time here at the top to do some initial framing of that state analysis we did to try and understand the particular context of the funding systems in the 3 states that we analyzed, which were California, Ohio, and Texas. And throughout our conversation here today, we'll talk about some of that broader context about the policies that govern each state's primary revenue sources, along with their potential implications for institutional behavior and how institutions might be responding to aligned or even in some cases misaligned opportunities to support students. And the central question that guided our study was, it was a simple one, but it was a crucial one. And it was, how can states develop finance systems that empower and motivate community colleges to reach their full potential? Next slide. And before we dive into the specifics of the mapping that we did, I want to first frame out the broader context for those 3 states we studied, because those are the details that help establish the context in which community colleges in these states are funded and operate. The first question you might be wondering is how we came to choose the 3 states that we did. And basically, we chose California, Ohio, and Texas because they have 3 very different systems in terms of size and scope, as well as system governance. And it's this variation that helps to reveal the diversity and the complexity of community college finance in each state. And this context provides an analytical framework for how the financing system might affect the circumstances and the resources and the capacity for community colleges to adopt and implement effective reforms that are student-centered. So in California, you can see here, they are a very large system of the 3 states that we studied. They have the largest system with 116 colleges and 1.5 million FTEs. And they have a governance structure with a state board and locally elected boards of trustees across the state's 73 college districts. And then in Ohio, as some of you may already be aware, this one was the smallest of the 3 states that we examined, with just 23 colleges and roughly 111,000 FTEs. There is no system or no governance system in Ohio. Ohio has trustees appointed according to each institution type. There is an association, OACC, that helps bring the community colleges together, but no overall governing entity in Ohio. And then lastly, in Texas, Texas sits kind of right there in the middle with 50 colleges and just under 600,000 FTEs. Texas does not have a statewide system or a statewide governing body, but there is a state level coordinating board that regulates locally elected boards that govern each of the 50 college districts. Next slide. When we take a look at state appropriations in the aggregate, we do see some variation in the percentage of total revenue going to community colleges coming from the state. And we'll break down the components of this revenue shortly, but just sort of still at the aggregate level here, in California, 64% of community college funding comes from the state. And this money is appropriated through a funding model. And when we're talking about the total amount of state funding that the community college system gets in California, they have Proposition 98, which sets a funding floor. About 11% of Prop 98 dollars are allocated to the community college system. The rest goes to their public K-12 schools. So while there's some variation within the total allocation that the community college system gets from the state, Prop 98 is really intended to offer some stability and predictability for the colleges. So, setting aside how state dollars are allocated to each individual college in the system, there is some level of predictability in California for at least a rough level of funding that the colleges get. In Ohio, by contrast, 42% of community college funding on average comes from the state. And post-secondary funding is set in Ohio each biennium by the state legislature to the state share of instruction, or the SSI. And that overall budget pool includes both community colleges and the four-year institutions. And usually this pool increases fairly modestly each year. I think the most recent increase was about 1.5% to that SSI. Broken down between the community colleges and the 4 years, about 23% of the total SSI appropriation is allocated to the community college sector. And then from there, that 23% pot is directed to each college through a funding formula. And then in Texas, different from all the others, 20% of community college funding currently comes from the state. Now, I should note that we do anticipate this amount will most likely be adjusted through the reforms that were enacted just earlier this year through House Bill 8. But the amount allocated to community colleges pre-HB 8 was determined by the legislature each biennium, like in Ohio. But there's no standardized method used to determine the level of funding each college gets. And again, HB 8 will help provide some standardization for the state appropriations made to their community colleges. And this is something that we're monitoring closely as Texas works its way through the implementation phase of HB 8. But as you can see here, 3 very different states with different levels of state funding and different approaches to how state appropriations are determined for the colleges. And these different approaches, they all help to establish that context for how those community colleges in each state are able to operate, including how they're able to plan, how they budget, and how they're able to invest in those student-centered reforms, and then go on to sustain those reforms to be able to have meaningful and long-lasting impact. Next slide. So the first step in our analysis was to map the major revenue sources for community colleges. And we identified the proportion of total revenue derived from each of 3 primary community college revenue sources: state appropriations, tuition, and local recurring revenue. So putting that state revenue stream that we just talked about in the broader context of other major revenue streams, here we see again some pretty wide variation across these 3 states. For California, nearly 2/3 comes from the state, with the next largest funding source coming from local revenue and the smallest proportion coming from tuition revenue. In Ohio, you have 42% coming from the state. Now, I do want to note that even though the state is not the majority funder in Ohio as a share of all funding sources, the state share for community colleges is nevertheless significant. State funding is important for the community colleges' overall bottom line, and it does get the attention of campus leaders. And I want to note that OACC has done a great job of being intentional about campus's awareness and making the link between funding and student success initiatives that are going on. So I wanted to note that. Then in Ohio, the other 40% comes from tuition revenue, with just 18% coming from local funding sources. And here, again, I want to note that only a handful of colleges in Ohio have local funding. I think it's 6 colleges. And that helps explain, at least in part, that lower reliance on local funds in the state. By stark contrast, in Texas, community colleges are heavily reliant on local funding. On average, in 2020, nearly half of community college funding in Texas came from local resources, with some pretty significant variation from college to college, but on average, about half. And then 20% came from the state and 30% came from tuition. Again, some of this will change due to HB 8, but this was the most recent model. Next slide. And here I want to take a macro look at the some of the equity implications of community college funding streams, both for institutions and for students. So in our analysis, we identified two major types of equity. One is institutional equity in terms of how they're funded across the board. And then there's also student equity, which refers to policies that directly affect equitable access to community colleges, as well as equity in outcomes for students. And this table here offers a concise overview and comparison of how the different elements within each state's community college finance system collectively promote or lead to equitable student access and equitable student outcomes. So California, as you can see here, has a strong emphasis on equitable student access and a modest impact on equitable student outcomes. That's what the green and the gray there mean. And a lot of that has to do with how state funding is distributed. And then we see pretty equitable institutional funding in California as well. And this has to do with both the level of state funding and also how they deal with local revenues that come into the system and then are doled out to the colleges from there. In Ohio, we see a strong negative effect on equitable student access. And much of this owes to how the overall funding resources break down between state funding and tuition revenue, in addition to the allocation of state resources. And then because Ohio has a strong outcomes-based funding system, we see a positive emphasis on equitable student outcomes. And we see a modest negative emphasis on equitable institutional funding. And this is largely due to the fact that there's, again, very limited local funding, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago. And then with Texas, again, just a caveat about the changes we'll likely see as a result of HB 8. This analysis is, again, pre-HB 8. And, we hope that when we redo this work, those orange boxes will end up changing color, hopefully up to the green level. But in the 2020 model, we see a pretty negative effect across the board here for all of the equity categories. Next slide. So looking at all of this information at the macro level, we mapped community college funding based on the variations in the different revenue streams for our three states. And the process by which we mapped the finance systems consisted of 4 key steps. The first was to map those major revenue sources that we've been talking about. Once we did that, we then mapped them onto the controlling policies that dictated how each revenue stream was calculated, allocated, and spent. Then from there, we mapped it onto the incentives that are driven by the revenue sources and the policies that control them. And then lastly, we mapped them onto the equity implications that we just talked about. Next slide. And from there, we developed flowcharts for each state to help illustrate how the policies that control the distribution and use of each funding system create institutional incentives that may or may not always be consistent with or align with the needs of students or states. So basically, we created these flowcharts to give you a sense of just how important it is to know not only where the money for a state's community colleges comes from, but also where that money is going and why. And I'll go through these maps quickly. We have a map for each of the 3 states, but I'll go through this quickly because we have a report with more details. And if you want more details, you can dive into the report to check those details out. But California's community college system our finance system is notably different from the other two states in our analysis. In California, the distribution and use of funds from each revenue source is largely governed by state policy. It's the state that sets an annual funding target for each community college district, combining state appropriations with tuition and local recurring revenue to meet this target. And this policy significantly reduces potential inequities between districts due to the reliance on local recurring revenue. Almost all tuition, local recurring revenue, and 83% of state appropriations are channeled through California's student-centered funding formula. And the funding formula mainly incentivizes enrollment, allocating about 70% of its funds based on full-time equivalent students. However, I also want to note that it does also encourage equitable access and attainment by distributing 20% of formula funds according to the enrollment of low-income and undocumented students in the state, while the remaining 10% is linked to student outcomes with a premium for low-income students. Next slide. Of the three states in our study, Ohio's finance system, I would say, strikes the most even balance between incentivizing enrollment and incentivizing student outcomes. So compared to the other states, Ohio's funding formula places a stronger emphasis on student outcomes, especially equitable outcomes. 100% of state appropriations in Ohio are tied to outcomes, and the formula heavily weighs outcomes achieved by students that require more resources and support. And additional state resources are reserved for institutions that enroll, support, and credential students who are low income, Black, Hispanic, adult, and those who are underprepared. Next slide. And lastly, in Texas, their community colleges have a disproportionately high reliance on local recurring revenue, which, as I've been mentioning, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, has led to significant institutional funding inequities across some districts. Pre-HB 8, student outcomes were incentivized by a very small portion of the overall community college finance system in Texas. And the outcomes portion of their funding model was tied outcomes to only 3% of total revenue. Again, this will most likely change due to HB 8. Next slide. And just a quick summary of our cross-state analysis. Student outcomes incentives are fairly modest across the three states, highest in Ohio, lowest in Texas, again, pre-HB 8. Enrollment incentives across all three states were the highest, with the highest in California and lowest in Texas. And as we've already touched on, the distinction between the proportion of local revenue that might drive inequitable institutional funding, particularly focusing on Texas and California here, California really neutralizes this effect because, again, they pool those resources at the state level, then distribute them through their funding model to the institutions. In Texas, again, pre-HB 8, Texas exacerbates this effect with very significant inequities and variation at the state level of local funding that is available to their community colleges. As we just saw a few moments ago, student equity effects are mixed and inconsistent across the states. And finally, a large percentage of incentive neutral money could probably be used more effectively through institutional policy or through some activities that ensure more equity. Next slide. And just lastly, on the implications and utility of this analysis for the field, community colleges need enough funding to be able to support students, and this funding should be given out to institutions equitably. But that's not the only thing needed for community colleges to keep up with their evolving demands. To be able to ensure effective finance policies, we need to do at least we need to do at least three things. One is we need to fully understand the finance system in each state. We need to know where the money comes from. We need to know how it's distributed, and we need to know what that money is spent on. Secondly, is we need to look at the different revenue streams, both looking at the individual components on their own, and then we need to look at all the components all together, taking a look at that whole picture, like what we've done in our analysis. And we really need to get a better understanding of the impact that these revenue streams have on colleges and assess the incentives and the equity implications that follow from them. And thirdly, we need to identify the best ways to make effective student-centered reforms. So all of this provides really important context for the institutional analysis that CCRC led, and how institutions can make decisions within the broader funding environment to invest in those student-centered reforms. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ariel to take it from here.
Thanks, Stephanie. As the state policy analysis revealed, community college finance systems are complex and vary by state. But what does that mean at the institutional level? How do colleges navigate these policies and deploy available resources to support student success while helping meet their state's workforce needs? The institutional analysis component of this work aims to help bridge this gap between state policy developments and what happens on the ground. That is, how these policies impact institutional practice, including resource allocation. And to that end, we examined 8 participating colleges' student success initiatives, how they operate, who they serve, and their resource requirements. And as part of this work, we also identified and cost out select student success initiatives. Importantly, we situated what we learned from colleges in local and state contexts to better understand how economic and political environments shape institutional behavior, and specifically the implementation of initiatives and strategies that reduce disparities in persistence and attainment by race and income. And we're using this information to help build the field's capacity to work toward community college systems that can be more transparent and constructive, or what we call institution-centered. So my colleague Carmen from CCRC and I are excited to walk through some select findings from the institutional analysis work, highlighting this interplay between state policy and institutional practice. So Stephanie described state finance systems in our sample strongly incentivize community colleges to focus on enrollment. And this played out in several ways at the institutional level. Notably, across our sample, college leaders cited enrollment stabilization as a key priority. As one administrator put it, maintaining and trying to expand enrollment is a prerequisite to student success. So, to offset pandemic-related enrollment declines, our data show how colleges have taken proactive steps to reduce barriers to access through expanded tuition programs such as promise programs, coupled with targeted outreach and recruitment strategies. We also heard about affordability initiatives like the Ohio College Combat Compact, and we also learned about how colleges are deploying more sophisticated enrollment management practices and in-reach strategies via call centers, two-way text messaging initiatives to boost applicant yields. And lastly, colleges are leveraging more strategic community partnerships to reach students, especially those from historically underserved backgrounds. For example, a college in Ohio developed off-site access centers to connect adult learners with more accessible workforce training and other programming. And these centers not only attended to local needs, but created a pipeline to program enrollment. And relatedly, the pandemic has really elevated the importance and urgency of basic needs. In response, colleges are increasingly recognizing the need to support basic support such as food, transportation, childcare, and other resources. However, as the state policy analysis revealed, funding models and programs don't adequately support investment in these services. And as a result, relative to instructional activities, student support services are more likely to rely on grant funding, including federal and philanthropic dollars, particularly in early stages of program development. For example, one college in our sample leveraged a large philanthropic grant to construct and operate a comprehensive basic needs center, which continues to rely heavily on in-kind donations to meet growing capacity and resource needs. Another college in our sample leveraged federal Title III dollars to support a one-stop connection center. So while sample colleges have remained committed to meeting students' basic needs, our institutional analysis revealed some of the challenges colleges navigate when relying on funds that are often more tenuous and fragile. For example, several stakeholders spoke about challenges in scaling and institutionalizing grant-funded initiatives, and staffing in particular was a concern. And ultimately, state finance models and other policies have not kept pace with the needs of community colleges, especially in regard to basic needs investments. So I'll pass the baton to Carmen to continue sharing some insights.
Thanks, Ariel. So Ariel spoke to some of the institutional level priorities and interventions that bridge some student equity issues. But the third piece of our analysis is focused on the bigger picture of how states can better incentivize their institutions to uplift student outcomes, particularly for pockets of students that are traditionally underserved, such as low-income or adult learners. And so our institutional analysis is really focused on providing the how for states to better support their institutions in achieving these goals. Next slide. The primary intervention that we've seen at the state level is a prevalence of performance-based funding. In the past 2 decades, we've seen a number of states implementing performance-based or outcomes-based funding mechanisms to attempt to produce more explicit incentives for institutions to lift student outcomes by ultimately doling out funding to institutions that promote upward mobility and broader workforce development for their students. As of 2022, we note that over 30 states have some form of performance-based funding. And across our own sample, we observed performance-based funding mechanisms at varying doses, with Ohio having the highest dosage performance-based funding scheme, as mentioned by Stephanie earlier. And by determining some of the outputs or outcomes that institutions should strive for, performance-based funding leaves some of the inputs or the how to the institutions themselves, therefore creating some variation at the institutional level. And our research really tries to attempt to address some of the how that institutions and states can meet these objectives. Next slide, please. And through our research, we find that performance-based funding presents both caveats, but also opportunities for community colleges and their respective states to align and reconfigure around discrete student outcomes. Our observations from the field draw upon some of the challenges and opportunities that institutions are seeing, particularly in states where there is performance-based funding. And our first potential opportunity really focuses on the institutional level with interinstitutional level inequities that can result from local factors such as access to local levy. We note that there are colleges with no or low access to local tax bases, and this creates a little bit of unevenness in the playing field. But we note that these inequities can be ameliorated at the state level through the inclusion of stabilization funding. And for example, Texas's new performance-based funding model under HB8 accounts for some of the delta between colleges' core operating expenses and the revenues that they are able to collect for local levy. So one of our findings is that local levy could be an important consideration for states as they're shaping their performance-based funding mechanisms. Our second opportunity really centers around the institutional level ability to serve traditionally underserved pockets of students who may face greater barriers to achieving the outcomes outlined by the state's performance-based funding. One practice in Ohio that we'd like to elevate is that Ohio's funding formula explicitly assigns weights to student populations such as low income and adult learners through their access grants. And notably, we found that in fiscal year 2023, about 63 million was appropriated through access grants intended to target these populations. And lastly, but not least, performance-based funding models, they attempt to encourage states and institutions to revisit and align on the discrete outcomes that ultimately best serve their educational attainment and workforce development goals. Community colleges, we find, particularly might face incentives to better provide shorter term and quicker ways through increasing certificates. So while these might not necessarily be the associate's degrees that are traditionally associated with community colleges, our interviews suggest that shorter term credentials with strong ties to the workforce may ultimately better serve the immediate learning needs of adult learners. And as Ariel noted earlier, we know that some colleges in Ohio are offering off-site locations that are strategically placed to better deliver workforce training. So in conclusion, the main opportunity that we think that performance-based funding provides is that performance-based funding attempts to and potentially allows for states and institutions to align on their strategic priorities. Yet one area for further research and an area that we still need guidance on is the means to which we can achieve some of these outcomes. And ultimately, our research project attempts to build upon the body of evidence that provides more details on how institutions can achieve these outcomes and also how states can support their institutions in doing so. And with that, I will pass it to Jack Hershey from the Ohio Association of Community Colleges. Oh, and before we leave, we just wanted to highlight this one quote showing that an admin from Ohio is noted that they're more focused on adult populations due to the performance-based funding model.
Great. Thank you. And I'll actually help facilitate this discussion with Jack. I want to invite him into the conversation. Jack, as has been noted throughout this presentation, Ohio was one of the 3 states studied in the study, both at the state as well as the institutional level. And certainly the reference to the state's funding model that's been in place for about 10 years now, which is, providing for pretty significant incentives for outcomes, but particularly incentives for the enrollment and success of underserved students. So if we can just go to the next slide for some of the discussion questions, if you could just kind of reflect on how this type of analysis, understanding the broader scope of resources that community colleges are responding to, be it state, be it tuition, be it local, can really help state policymakers understand and inform state investment in community colleges.
And thanks, Martha. I think I liked the phrase earlier that Ohio was almost perfectly balanced in our incentives between enrollment and completion. We certainly still feel the enrollment pressure, right? Our labor market and our workforce situation in Ohio says we need to educate a lot more people than we are currently, and that means we need more people enrolled as well. And so that balance, which was the predominant balance in most of the other states that you all looked at, that is still very real here in Ohio. But 10 years ago, when the state made the decision to put all of the state's money into completion, it was a game-changing moment for Ohio. And I would add this context to that decision. Previously, all of our state funding came in a distribution formula that I'd say from a state legislator standpoint was meant to make sure that they could look at their local college and university and say, the amount of money you're getting is fair compared to what other local colleges and universities are getting throughout the state. 10 years ago, I think the state said, well, we would like to actually put some incentives in that funding. We still want it to be fair, and we still want to be able to look and say that what you're getting is fair, but they sort of looked at the community colleges and said, you need to do a better job of increasing your success rates. I would say that that's worked, right? A couple stats that I'll say after 10 years of living with this formula, our graduation rate has increased 200% versus what it was when under the old funding formula. And if you look at to show that our momentum is still continuing, the Student Clearinghouse just put out a recent report, and it would show that Ohio's completion rates in the community college system are twice as high as the national average. And so I do think that idea that state policymakers, there wasn't a lot of strings attached. I often say the way that this was rolled out in Ohio was that our state leaders trusted our higher education leaders and allowed them to design this formula. I think that is a huge lesson that I haven't seen a lot of other states repeat, but made a huge difference because our colleges decided, well, what do we need to do to incentivize ourselves to do essentially what the state is asking us to do. I think that is a huge lesson that I'd ask policymakers in other states to sort of look at in this, because it set a broad direction that I often say bought thousands of policy reforms throughout our system at individual campuses without having to get super specific and pass a piece of legislation that says thou shalt implement this policy. It set a broad direction from the state that allowed college leaders to do what they do best, which is run their systems, right, in a way that they think is best, and with sort of that broad discussion at the top.
Right. Actually, that's a great kind of transition into this next question, in terms of, as Carmen and Ariel noted, right, the funding model kind of describes the what that the state wants, and the what in the context of other resources and revenue streams institutions are operating under, but it doesn't tell institutions the how, in terms of how to achieve those objectives and those incentives. So you can talk a little bit about what you've seen, both from your kind of leadership at OACC, as well as the institutional responses to how institutions have responded to these incentives to really inform what they're doing on campuses, to both provide better access to students as well as support their success.
Yeah, Martha, I feel like too many times states set funding formulas, just general. It doesn't have to be just higher ed, but in this case, we'll talk about higher ed. And it's a sort of a set it and forget it type mindset. We pass a thing and then we just hope that everybody listens and follows the incentives within the formula. And our experience is you've got to put a little bit more effort into it than that. So when Ohio adopted this new funding model, one of the other things they did was pass a law that said that every college had to take to their board of trustees every 2 years a strategic plan specifically on completion. And so you had to lay out to the state, here's what we're going to work on for the next 2 years in order to increase our completion rates. Our association has then sort of taken that and built a process around that with a lot of resources and a lot of convenings over time. So we know every 2 years that comes. When it does, we will pull together teams across the state, bring in national experts like those from HCM and CCRC who've helped us along this journey, but we'll bring in other states, we'll bring in other colleges, we'll highlight the good work of our own colleges to sort of say, these are the specific things you'll have to do. We've wrapped the entire guided pathways model around our funding formula so that colleges really understand what to do. We will give them data reports every year. It's one thing to look at a spreadsheet that says, oh, my state funding went down 2%. It's a wholly different thing when we can provide to a college, you know, your funding went down because the number of associate degree earners in STEM fields went down. And so if you can focus on that area and figure out why your graduation rates, it just provides a little bit more direction and vision for a campus leader to implement something, as opposed to sort of this big, oh my gosh, my state funding went down, what do I do? To us, that has led to, you know, a lot of meetings, a lot of convenings, probably close to 100 over the last 10 years, where we're bringing together campus leadership teams, faculty, administrators on a whole slew of issues, right? There's no silver bullet to increasing completion amongst community college students, right? It requires you to look at every step of a student's pathway and what you as a college are doing, what your students need. And so that has led to a tremendous amount of work that's been done at our campus levels, but it doesn't happen by magic, right? To me, you have to be pretty purposeful about it. And going back to my like set it and forget it, you know, in the state of Ohio, basic aid to colleges and universities is about $2 billion per year. It takes a very small amount of money in comparison to help people understand that formula and to help them really implement policies and procedures that are meant to help them gain in that funding formula. We do it as an association. We do it in great partnership with our State Department of Higher Education. It's a strategy that I think more states should put a little bit more time and attention into, is how you actually implement and help colleges take advantage of whatever policy levers, you know, are set by the state.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, certainly. I think Ohio, as we've noted, is, you know, probably leading and somewhat unique in the role you've played and the attention you've played, not just to implementing or not just to having the policy, but to supporting the kind of implementation understanding of the funding model. And I want to kind of take a step back, and you know, when we looked at those maps and the kind of analysis of the revenue streams community colleges are operating under, we looked at the kind of core buckets of local revenue, tuition, and kind of core state appropriations. But if you can kind of put on a lens of, you know, certainly there's likely other state activity or other local activity that's going on either in the form of resources or policies that might not be captured in this kind of initial analysis that could certainly influence the budgeting and decision-making of campuses. Could you talk a little bit from your context in Ohio, what some of those other policies and investments might be?
Yeah, Martha, I mean, we have a long list, right, of things we'd like to change about our formula. We have some principles as well in our formula that all of our college leaders have adopted. And so we've got to be consistent. We've got to have good data. It's got to be equal across all. The lack of data sometimes really does hurt us in terms of doing things that we would like to do in our formula. The biggest one, I will say that, and I'll say because I'm excited that we might actually be inching forward in this, is, you know, community colleges do a lot more than just educate people on a pathway to a bachelor's degree. We have a big workforce mission as well. So I sometimes sort of simplify things and say, you know, we have one customer who is a university, and if we're taking a student who wants to transfer on and become get a bachelor's degree at a university, then we have to follow sort of their rules and regulations and make sure that the transfer works well for that student. But the other half is local businesses in our area who need people trained directly, and they go straight into the labor market and work. That we have really poor data on in Ohio, and I think in most states, right? I think we've learned maybe Iowa is the best state in the nation in terms of really collecting really good workforce level data. And to me, workforce is usually programs that take a year or less to complete. Sometimes they're direct training paid for by a business to train people up for the thing. That data is all over the place. I'll say our legislature here in Ohio sort of got the ball rolling on this. They gave us some money in this last budget cycle with a recognition that yes, this workforce component of what we do is important. I will tell you that in Ohio, we've seen coming out of the pandemic that it's where the greatest student interest is, right? If there are jobs available, a lot of our students that we talk to are not interested in waiting 2 years to get that job. And so they're going to look for the shortest term path to the job, and then take it. And hopefully then the employer supports them and eventually earning their certificate or associate degree. That requires data. That requires a lot of work, and we don't have it in the state of Ohio right now. We thought maybe it would be an easy, well, let's just copy what some other states have done, right? As we've looked at other states, they're still working on it. Even Iowa, who's been doing it for 20 years, is still trying to figure out how they put their stuff together. So I'm glad we've started when we started, right? Because we're realizing it's going to take us a while to build that out, but it's an incredibly important, critically important part of the mission of any community college across the nation is figuring out that direct workforce line. And for whatever reason, we just haven't paid enough attention to it at a policy level. We've paid way more attention to the more traditional pathway of a community college student who wants to get a bachelor's degree at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you. Yes, and certainly I think that's probably, for any state participants that are joining us today, certainly I'm sure the topic of investment in workforce or shorter term credentials that might not be captured in this case in Ohio's funding model, for example, ensuring that there's, direct investments and pathways aligned to workforce demand. So before I turn it back to Susan or to open it up for Q&A, first I want to thank you, Jack, for joining us and being willing to engage in this discussion and kind of take the work that we've done and put it in a very particular context of Ohio. Also want to kind of give a plug to some additional resources in addition to the report that lays out the mapping. We also have a tool to allow states to give states some guidelines on how to potentially do your own mapping, and can certainly ensure that you receive those resources. But want to again thank Ariel and Carmen for joining us as well. And Susan, I'll turn it over to you for any Q&A.
Thanks, Martha. We had a question from Elaine Frisbee. Elaine is the Vice President for Finance and Administration with the Kansas Board of Regents. And Elaine, correct me if I screw this up, but when I saw the question, you asked, it'd be really interesting to hear how this works in states that are undersubscribed. This distinction often gets overlooked. Those of us with excess capacity live this every day. And so I wondered if one of you or some of you could address Elaine's question. I hope I got that right, Elaine.
Sure. I will start, and then I actually might turn to Jack to put this in kind of maybe in context of Ohio. I think the undersubscribed notion, if I'm understanding that right, is really kind of under enrolled. Institutions that likely are not at their full capacity in terms of where they once were. Certainly, I would say that's a phenomenon that we're seeing across many states, and particularly in certain parts and different regions within states. I do think that this type of work can help one, depending on how the state resources are directed, could potentially provide incentive for institutions to really focus on what they're doing well. So certainly not necessarily anything around, consolidation or closing down institutions, but directing resources in a way that really enhances institutions to one, expand capacity and expand enrollment to underserved and under-enrolled populations, but also to really focus on the programs and pathways that they are best at. And really kind of enhance their, be it a transfer mission or a workforce mission. Certainly, I think there's ways that the states can direct resources in a way that supports institutions to do that. But Jack, I don't know if, well, I do know, but to put it in your words, if Ohio has had to navigate, enrollment challenges for particular institutions, and how you think the funding formula has or has not helped navigate those challenges.
Yeah, Martha, we've certainly had enrollment challenges, especially during the pandemic, although we don't really measure ourselves on enrollment anymore, right? I mean, I know that's the traditional way of higher education measuring itself. We now measure ourselves on completion rates, and so we often say that we are achieving the largest college graduation ceremonies in our history at a time when our enrollment is nowhere near its highest levels. And so I think that's the right balance, right? I will say that over that 10 years and those 100 meetings and gatherings that we've talked about, we've certainly talked about looking at your programs and enrollment. And I think most community colleges in Ohio can tell you they've shut down some programs, either because it's low enrollment or because the business and industry in their area has shifted. And so it's just not as important anymore. You'd also do that in terms of, I think you'd also have some that would say they are either at enrollment or need more enrollment. I think, probably like a lot of states, are experiencing quite an economic boom right now as this overall movement of reshoring American manufacturing is happening in our state. And so we are seeing programs that we need to increase in size by 4 times the enrollment that we currently have in there. There's no community college system in the nation who would say that they're like overly funded by their state. And so that really does make you have sort of more strategic conversations about how you share resources. We're talking about potentially sharing faculty across colleges. Those things may happen more regularly in states that have systems. We do not. And so that's pretty new ground for us. I say that maybe as a sort of a big picture thing of like, I think that's what right incentives can do, right? At the state level, it forces you into sort of different conversations about how you solve these problems.
Thank you, Jack. And we just have a couple minutes left, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Martha, if folks have additional questions or want to learn more, it would be helpful, I think, to allow them to understand how they might tap the resources and folks that they've heard from today. And then before that, I just want to thank you all so much. We want to always leave you right with the balance of you're satisfied and you're hungry for more. And so we really hope that this has been an interesting and useful discussion for you today. It sure is. I've learned a lot, and I just want to thank our panelists. So. Martha, if there's additional questions or information, where might folks turn?
Absolutely. So you can reach out to HCM strategists. You can find us probably most easily than me trying to rattle off my email address is through our website, hcmstrategist.com. There you can access the report. We'll certainly share that out with you as well, Susan. And then I will leave it to Carmen or Ariel to note how best to reach out to the CCRC team.
Thanks, Martha. For us, we have a CCRC project webpage where you can find not only the HCM report link there, but that's where we have past presentations and other resources. from public-facing venues, and that's also where you can find our forthcoming publication, our final report, which describes some of these institutional case studies that we previewed in today's conversation.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again to our panelists and to all of the attendees. And it's 10 o'clock, at least in Minnesota. And so we'll sign off now. Thanks again.